All right, we have some big stories coming out in the news about Kamala Harris, about the Biden administration forgiving terrorists of 9/11. Benjamin Netanyahu wondering, is the United States going to back him or not? To help me go through that, I have Joel Pollack from Breitbart News. Joel, thank you so much for joining me.
It's good to be with you.
So this might be one of the crazier stories that I've read. President Biden and the White House have signed off on a plea deal with 3 of the 9/11 terrorists to basically allow them to avoid the death penalty if they will admit that they're guilty. We know that they're guilty. 3,000 people died. These people were captured. They've been in Guantanamo Bay for 20 plus years. What are your thoughts on the Biden administration doing this?
What you can see is one of many actions that Biden and his staff are taking that resemble what a lame duck president does, even though technically Biden still has until the November election, or at least the Biden-Harris administration could continue. You're seeing a lot of actions that are being taken in anticipation, not just of the end of a Democratic administration, but in anticipation of Trump returning to office. And they wanted to make sure they were able to move past this case, perhaps close down the Guantanamo Bay prison facility at some point, and prevent Donald Trump from using the death penalty to punish Khalid Sheik Mohammed and the others who planned 9/11. So this is just one of several actions that we see in our government and other governments as leaders around the world begin to realize Donald Trump really could be the next president. That's also the case even in the aftermath of Kamala Harris emerging as the likely Democratic nominee. She's doing well in the polls. Democrats seem to like her, but she's not yet really proven. She had a terrible 2020 presidential campaign. So the odds probably slightly favor Trump, assuming we have a free and fair election, which is not a safe assumption anymore. And I think governments, including our own, are starting to say, well, let's do everything we can before Trump gets into office. Let's run through our list of priorities and get away with whatever we can. And that includes people in the Biden administration who are taking this opportunity. You're going to see more of these stories as we head toward November and January of Biden and his cronies doing whatever they can to push left-wing policies through the door. And this is one of them. Remember that Obama ran on shutting down Guantanamo Bay. He couldn't do it. And the left for many years didn't want anything to happen to these detainees. They didn't want anyone to be punished. People like Eric Holder, former Attorney General of the United States, and his law firm, they actually defended these terrorists and so forth. Not that they're not entitled to a defense, but for some reason, defending these terrorists was never an impediment to government service in subsequent administrations. But if you're a lawyer who defended someone Democrats don't like, you can't serve in any function, really. Look at the January 6th defendants, look at the Trump campaign, how impossible it is for Trump aides to get lawyers. So you're seeing Democrats kind of running through their to-do list before they lose power in January. And what I've written about in my book, The Agenda, is what Trump should do in the first 100 days in office. There's another story in the news also about Russia agreeing to a prisoner swap. It looks like a bad deal, just like all of Obama, Biden, Harris's deals are bad. They're really bad at negotiating with the world. The only time they ever get tough is with their domestic opponents. But they are getting Evan Gershkovich back. He's the Wall Street Journal reporter falsely accused of espionage, as well as Paul Whelan, a former U.S. Marine. And in exchange, we're giving them some pretty serious Russian terrorist and assassin, apparently, in one case, is going back to Russia. So a really bad deal. But again, Donald Trump said that if these hostages, as he called them correctly, if these hostages are not returned to the United States by the time I take office, there's going to be hell to pay. And so the Russian government is also saying, all right, let's see what we can get done before the change of power in the United States.
Okay. I mean, I could understand Biden saying, you know what, on my way out, I'm going to forgive Hunter, my son, but I'm going to forgive 9/11 terrorists. I mean, why not just forgive Hamas terrorists? I mean, it's crazy to me. If I was one of the 9/11 families, I would be just rolling over angry. I just couldn't believe when I read that this morning. Speaking of the Hamas situation, that was the last time you were on the show. I want to make sure that we covered that. But first, I wanted to get your take on a majority of Democrat leaders who benefit from Jewish money in order to get elected and stay elected, skipping the visit of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And then you juxtapose that with them fawning over and tripping over themselves to welcome Voldymr Zelensky. What are your thoughts on their behavior?
Well, the Democratic Party does have a large number of Jewish donors, but there are many Jewish donors in American politics who don't have anything to do with the Jewish community other than the fact that they happen to be Jewish. I mean, George Soros, to my knowledge, has never contributed to any kind of Jewish institutional cause whatsoever. He's got no connection to the Jewish community other than trying to undermine the security of Israel by funding J Street, which is essentially an anti-Israel group, and also by funding various other radical organizations that are linked to anti-Semitic behavior. So I don't know that the word or term Jewish money really fits, but I will say that there's a split emerging within the Democratic Party about Israel. It really began under Obama. Obama was the first who let the anti-Israel extremist left out of the closet within the Democratic Party. And in 2012, at the Charlotte Democratic National Convention, Democrats were embarrassed when they had to push through a floor vote on a change to the platform to add back in some of the pro-Israel language of previous years that had been taken out to satisfy this new anti-Israel extremist left-wing fringe, which includes, by the way, important segments of the Muslim and Arab American voting community, unfortunately. And that has been going on for quite a while. The left has taken over within the Democratic Party. They really effected that change with the Biden administration, which relied entirely on the policy advisors and the policies of Bernie Sanders, with a few moderate changes here and there. But essentially, the left ran this administration as I predicted it would. And they don't like the fact that Netanyahu came to the United States to criticize their failed policy on the Middle East. Remember, in 2015, Obama was pushing the Iran nuclear deal, which was a terrible failure, and Netanyahu came to warn him not to do it, or at least if he was going to do it, to include certain things that Obama didn't want to include, like guarantees that Iran wouldn't fund terror. Those warnings were quite prescient because Iran continued funding terror. That's why we are where we are now. And the Democrats were upset because they thought Netanyahu was going to come to rebuke the Obama administration for dragging its feet in the war against Hamas. And for the most part, Netanyahu was actually pretty polite. The only time he really got into criticizing the administration was very indirectly, when he said that Israel had gone into Rafah, the southern Gaza city, and had done so without really causing any major Palestinian civilian casualties, but wiping out hundreds, if not thousands, of Hamas terrorists. And that was a dig at Biden and at Kamala Harris, who both said that Israel shouldn't go into Rafah because of the possibility of civilian casualties. So Netanyahu calls it like it is. He is a statesman. They are not. He understands the Middle East. They do not. He stands up for his country. They do not. And he also stands up for America, and they don't, which is amazing. Why would we need a foreign leader to celebrate America's triumphs? I mean, in 2015, when Netanyahu spoke, in fact, it was 2011, he spoke also to Congress, and he was the first leader of any kind, American or foreign, to congratulate the American people in a big way about the killing of Osama bin Laden. And Obama had announced that Osama bin Laden had been killed, but had tried to tamp down any celebrations, for fear of offending the Muslim community or Muslim terrorists, even though they said he wasn't a Muslim terrorist. But Netanyahu just came in front of Congress and said, hey, congratulations, you killed the world's worst terrorist. And finally, Americans were able to applaud. So these Democrats, they're owned by the left. They're owned by George Soros, who is anti-Israel. And I don't think it has anything to do with the welfare of the Jewish community or even the viewpoint of the majority of American Jews. Chuck Schumer refused to shake Netanyahu's hand in Congress. He did shake his hand in private. That tells you there's a level of duplicity going on, but they don't want to be seen in public shaking Netanyahu's hand. Various members of Congress boycotted, and they looked ridiculous. I mean, Pelosi, who wasn't even there, said it was one of the worst addresses by any foreign leader to Congress. I mean, what a terrific, it's so ridiculous, actually, to say that. First of all, it was a fantastic address that got something like 53 ovations. Secondly, when she says that, she's trashing the people who were part of the speech, who were mentioned in the gallery, the survivors of the October 7th terror attack, the soldiers who lost limbs fighting terrorists. I mean, that's who they're really attacking. So I think that Democrats have a real problem, and they don't get out of it by swapping Kamala Harris in for Joe Biden. Joe Biden, for all of his other flaws, was at least more or less a known quantity within the American Jewish community. They didn't like his performance entirely in this current war, but they did trust that at least at some level he had some kind of love for Israel. Kamala Harris doesn't. She married a Jewish guy, Doug Emhoff. But Doug Emhoff doesn't really know much about being Jewish. He led the president's anti-Semitism strategy, which was and remains a disaster because it was negotiated with CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is an anti-Semitic organization that was an unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation terrorism funding trial that was funding Hamas. So to have those people in the room making decisions about what is and isn't anti-Semitic tells you what a joke this strategy was. Doug Emhoff also, inter alia, went on a riff recently against toxic masculinity. The last thing we need in a second gentleman, or whatever they're going to call him, first gentleman, whatever he becomes, if he's the first lady of the United States, the last thing we need is some kind of weak man who's completely subservient, not just to his wife, but to the left, and can't stand up for other men. I mean, I'm not one of these guys that goes on and on about how to be a man kind of thing, but it should be just obvious that there's certain kinds of things you don't do, and you don't trash men who are doing things men do, like fighting wars and rescuing people and standing up for themselves. I mean, that, anyway, that's a side point. The Jewish community is split on Israel. The vast majority of Jews support Israel, something like 95%, maybe 5% don't. But the 5% who don't are very vocal, and they're very well funded, and they are represented in the Democratic Party beyond their proportion of the Jewish population. And then you've got the other problem, which is that the majority of American Jews don't put Israel as their top priority. That's probably changed since October 7th. But for Jews who vote Democratic, they'll tell you that abortion is their number one issue. They're very much like cultural liberals in every way. But still, having these Democrats in Congress boycotting Netanyahu's speech was really embarrassing, not just for the country, but for them.
Yeah, no, I agree. Okay, you have a book out about what Donald Trump should do in the first 100 days. Give my audience an idea, as you've studied this out, as you've thought this out, if you were to sit down with former President Donald Trump and say, here's what I think the first 100 days should look like. Tell me what that looks like.
Well, I've outlined over 200 steps that Donald Trump can take on day one: executive orders, executive actions, memoranda, changes in policy, things that he has power as president to do. And I wanted to do that because we've seen in the past that when Trump came into office the first time, he had a Republican Congress, but they didn't do anything. They weren't ready for him. They couldn't fulfill their own promises on Obamacare and so forth. And you had this strenuous opposition from the media and from the Democrats. And he's going to come into office in January 2025 as essentially a lame duck president from the beginning. That's how the media are going to spin it. The story on day one is how Donald Trump can't do anything because he can't run again in 2028. And so we're going to talk about who the candidates are in 2028. I promise you, on January 21st, 2025, that's the story that's going to run, who the leading contenders are for 2028. So Trump needs to get in there. He needs to be effective, and he needs to tell people very clearly what he's going to do. Kamala Harris is the Democratic nominee to be, and right now, it doesn't seem like Trump and the Republicans know how to deal with her. It's not enough to point out that she's terrible. She's a bad candidate. She's achieved nothing. She's got all kinds of contradictions about identity and that sort of thing. Nobody cares about that. The only thing people care about is what this next election is going to produce for the American people. What are you going to do? And the reason Kamala Harris did badly in 2019, 2020, I always have to include 2019 because she actually quit the campaign before 2020 actually started. But the reason she did badly was she couldn't answer questions about policy. When she went on TV and she was asked, what are you going to do about private health insurance if you want Medicare for all? She kept giving contradictory answers. She doesn't know how to run anything, and she can't plan for the future. She can't sell a vision of what the future is about. But Donald Trump can. And based on Donald Trump's past policies, based on his past record, and based on what I think Donald Trump should do and can do in his first days in office, I wrote the agenda. And I wrote it starting back in May when Trump was convicted on those ridiculous charges in Manhattan. I was so outraged that this could happen in our country that I decided, rather than feeling upset and angry about it, I would do something positive and look ahead and try to envision Trump as president in 2025. And so that's what I did. So it goes through several categories of policies that Trump can enact, starting with rule of law. Rule of law meaning what the Department of Justice has done. And really, that's where the motivation for this book comes from, the abuse of justice in our country. But I think Trump should, for example, pardon all of the nonviolent January 6th prisoners. I mean, they are political prisoners. Most of them did nothing wrong. Most of them simply were on the Capitol lawn or were invited into the Capitol by police, and they were pressured into pleading guilty in many cases because their lives were going to be ruined. You can't restore a sense of fairness in this country and faith in the rule of law if you have these people still languishing in prison. It's absurd that we have political prisoners in America, but we do. And Steve Bannon, by the way, who wrote the foreword to my book, is one of them. The foreword was the last thing Steve wrote before going to prison. So I go through that. I go through some other things. And then the border. The border is top priority. Things that Donald Trump can do to secure the border, to make sure that we end this migration crisis. He has vast powers as president to do that. That was established during all the court cases during the first Trump administration. So I outlined several steps he can do on that. And I talk about inflation. I talk about foreign policy. He can end the war between Russia and Ukraine fairly quickly. And all of these are steps. Some of them will seem obvious to you, but they're not things the Democratic administration is going to do. And they're not things that a weaker, more establishment Trump administration, or excuse me, Republican administration would do. Only a Donald Trump could do these things. But he has to do them. They have to be laid out. And people have to have a sense of what the Trump administration is going to feel like. Otherwise, they get stuck in the personalities, they get stuck in the name calling, and they're not really sure what they're voting for. And the country needs direction. The country needs leadership. So I wrote the agenda to try to provide some of that.
Okay, great. I'm excited for people to be able to get that. You mentioned what they could do in the first 100 days. Hamas right now is still holding 100 hostages. You mentioned that Donald Trump said, those hostages better be returned before I even get into office, or there will be hell to pay. Do you see Kamala Harris being an effective negotiator? I mean, they're just now bringing her up to speed on what even happened in Israel, according to sources that I've read. Also, they're just barely bringing her up to speed on the Russia-Ukraine war. Like, she doesn't even know what's happening in these wars, and she has no experience with foreign policy, no experience with diplomacy or negotiation. I just don't see it going well. What are your thoughts on her as a top negotiator for these hostages?
Well, she can't negotiate anything. So it will fall to the Obama, Clinton, Biden Democrats who've been running all the negotiations in Democratic administrations for the last 20 years, and they've all failed. I mean, you don't get an Iran deal without really bad negotiators. Look at this. Trump negotiated the Abraham Accords, bringing together several Arab states with Israel, which John Kerry told us could never be done. And Trump did it. And yet, in 4 years of Joe Biden, there hasn't been a single new Arab country added to the Abraham Accords. Okay. The geniuses who run our foreign policy, who take negotiating classes at Harvard and other places, they don't know what they're doing. Trump knows what he's doing. And it's clear because he didn't have to pay heavy prices for the release of American prisoners. He didn't have to give up major concessions for America to get peace agreements or for America to get compliance from countries that were acting against our interests before he came into office. Kamala Harris won't do any of that. She doesn't know about any of that. And when Trump talks about freeing the hostages, he's really specifically talking about American hostages. So there are 5 American hostages still being held. They're all male. They have dual American Israeli citizenship. And he has said he wants them free. We don't hear anything about that from Biden. Harris met with some of the families of the hostages, but she's not doing anything, nor is Biden. And what Trump is doing is saying, look, I'm going to destroy you unless you give the hostages back. By the way, that's the only way you're going to get a hostage agreement between Israel and Hamas. In the early stages of the war, they did have a temporary pause in fighting where Hamas let go some of the elderly prisoners and some of the female prisoners, not all, and some of the children, again, not all. But that was mostly because Hamas thought it helped them in terms of PR. And they were under some military pressure to do it. They thought they would buy themselves a little bit of time. They didn't think Israel would really pursue its goal of completely destroying Hamas's military infrastructure. After that deal, I said the only possible deal, given that Israel wants to destroy Hamas and Hamas doesn't want to be destroyed, is one where Israel is able to say to Hamas, either you give up the hostages or you die. Like, there's no other option. And when Hamas believes that, then they'll give up the hostages to save their own skins, unless they want to die as quote unquote martyrs, which I don't think most of them do, by the way. That's why these leaders that Israel assassinated weren't fighting in Gaza, but sitting in 5-star hotels in Doha and Tehran and Beirut and so forth. So I think that Kamala Harris is a terrible negotiator. Oh, one other point about that. When I talk about how Trump has to emphasize the agenda and has to look forward, it doesn't mean ignore Kamala Harris's record, but it just means you're not going to convince people just by bashing her record. You have to talk about what you're going to do. But let's talk about freeing the hostages and going after bad guys. When Kamala Harris was district attorney of San Francisco, she had a really disturbing record of letting criminals go. She was elected because her predecessor was seen as too soft on crime. She was even softer. And then when she was elected California Attorney General, she got tough, but not on the criminals. She got tough on filmmakers who exposed Planned Parenthood. She got tough on donors who supported conservative organizations, but she didn't get tough on crime. And if you look at California today, where I live, I mean, I love this place, but it's run so badly. Crime is through the roof. It's not a safe place anymore. And that's because of Kamala Harris and George Gascon and George Soros and Gavin Newsom and all the Democrats who basically run this place into the ground to the point where it's almost unsalvageable. I mean, I still have hope, but she's part of that problem. She's part of that progression. So would she be tough on terrorists? I don't think so. She's never been tough on criminals. And look, the Biden-Harris administration is busy cutting this plea deal, as you mentioned. So I don't think she'd be tough. I don't think she'd be able to get any hostages out. In fact, I think given the way Democrats negotiate, which is basically to give up everything, unless they're dealing with Republicans who are the real enemy, Democrats give up everything to terrorists. I think we'll see more hostages taken if she's president, because to Vladimir Putin and to Hamas, it works.
Yeah. Trump hinted yesterday, can you imagine Kamala Harris hunting down terrorists? It won't ever happen, kind of planting that seed that she is not going to be good at this. Speaking of that, Netanyahu many months ago announced that Mossad would track down Hamas leaders around the world and execute them. Hezbollah recently fired rockets on a soccer field, killing 12 children, injuring 40 more. Then the world was shocked when suddenly Hamas political chief Ismail Haniyeh is killed in Tehran. This is just them fulfilling their promise. And now Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah, is saying that Iran is going to counterstrike and demolish Israel. Isn't this the plan, to try to avoid civilian casualties, but take out Hamas? Isn't Israel just following the exact plan they said they would?
Right. They're also following the Trump model, because if you remember, in January 2020, Trump took out the Iranian terror general, Qasem Soleimani, and Biden and Harris said, oh, there's going to be war. This is terrible. Trump doesn't know what he's doing. But he knew exactly what he was doing. And once he took out the terrorist general, Iran made a lot of noise. They fired some missiles at an American base, but they made sure they didn't hit anybody. And that was it. That was the end of it. So Israel is following the Trump model here by taking out terrorist leaders. I was actually in the community of Majd al-Shams on Tuesday, June 30th, just before I left Israel and returned to the States. And I was there. I saw the place where the rocket hit. I spoke to families of the victims, and they were so stricken by grief in this community that it's almost impossible to imagine the cruelty with which Hezbollah acted, again, on the instructions of Iran. They fired a rocket. It hit a soccer field in the middle of the afternoon when children were playing, killed 20 children, ages 10 through, I think the oldest was 20. So, young adult, but they also injured 30 other people. And it's a remote village. The residents, by the way, are Arabs. They're not Jews. They're part of Israel's Arab population, which makes up 20% of Israel. So Israel, acting in defense of its Arab citizens, took out Hezbollah's military commander, and they took out Hamas's political chief. And, the week isn't over yet. I mean, they could take out more. Iran's saying they're going to retaliate. They did attack Israel in April with 300 missiles and things like that, almost none of which actually reached their targets. That doesn't mean that the Iranians can't project a threat, but it does mean that threat has been neutralized by Israel's defenses. Also, Israel demonstrated that Iran basically has no air defenses. When Israel retaliated against that, they didn't really go for a full-scale retaliation, but they launched attacks on Iranian radar sites and other missile sites and sent a message to Tehran that we can strike you anytime and you can't do anything about it. Will an American president follow that model that Trump set down? Well, only if it's Trump, because Biden doesn't do things like that. And when Democrats get into power again, it's not that they don't kill terrorists. They do kill terrorists, but they basically do so in a way that doesn't really achieve anything. I mean, Obama was proud that he had this quote unquote kill list and he had it leaked to the New York Times. But that's the stage at which Obama was droning American citizens, and not in the United States, but abroad. And just almost willy-nilly launching these attacks and yet failing to address the actual terrorist threats from Al-Qaeda, from ISIS. He called ISIS junior varsity before they took over vast swaths of the Middle East, and it took Donald Trump to get rid of them. Look, I think we're taking a huge risk if we make Kamala Harris president of the United States. I'm not saying that because I want Trump to be president. I think everybody understands that. Democrats are falling in love with her because they need someone to lead the opposition. And I get that. As Americans, actually, we want a tough fight. We don't want Trump to win in a walk. We want Democrats to put forth the best candidate they can. But realizing that whoever they put forward is going to have to make decisions about policy and have a record to defend, this is one of the areas of clearest distinction between Trump and Harris. He had an incredibly successful 4 years in foreign policy in the Oval Office, and Biden and Harris have had a complete disaster. So the choice is pretty obvious, and I do think that the strike on the military leader of Hamas was good. I don't think Iran's retaliation is going to be all that consequential, although I could be wrong. If it is, I think Israel's retaliation to that retaliation is going to take things up a notch. And again, this wouldn't be happening if Trump were president. The Trump approach is the right approach. I wrote a book in 2020 called The Trumpian Virtues, saying no matter who's the next president, they should follow Trump's model on a variety of these things. And they didn't do that. They went back to the old Obama model, and that's why they're failing.
Yeah. Okay, final question. I know we're up against a clock here. Benjamin Netanyahu comes from Israel over to the United States. He's snubbed by Joe Biden initially and Kamala Harris. And so he immediately seeks for a meeting with Donald Trump. Do you think that he was signaling that he might prefer Donald Trump as president, or do you think he was maybe just making the best use of his time since they were not planning to meet with him?
Well, they did eventually meet with him, although it's noteworthy that Harris then came out from the meeting and made a statement that was absolutely absurd. She basically said that the war in Gaza is not a binary issue. You know, it's not about good and evil, which is just crazy. Of course, it's about good and evil. Evil is Hamas. Terrorism is evil. If you don't know that terrorism is evil, you shouldn't be president. But Netanyahu did meet with them, but I do think it is clear he prefers Trump. And he made that clear in a subtle way in his address to Congress. He thanked President Biden for his support for Israel during the war, but he also spent a long time thanking Trump for his support, not just during the war, but also his support as president. And he listed off a series of things that Trump had done as president. So I think it's clear Netanyahu is in the Trump camp. He has to hedge his bets a little bit in case Trump doesn't win. But, you know, when I was in Israel talking to Israelis, they are desperate for Donald Trump. They want the peace and the security that Donald Trump provided merely by giving Israel permission to fight its enemies. And that's the feeling in Israel. They don't trust Harris. They're trying to like her in some way because they know they might get stuck with her, but they want Trump. And I talk about this in the agenda. I talk about all the foreign policy things Trump should do, like ending the sanctions, ridiculous sanctions that Biden has imposed on Israeli citizens who in some cases are doing no more than exercising a legal right to protest. I think that there's a lot Trump can do to strengthen the U.S.-Israel relationship and to strengthen the United States simply by issuing certain executive orders, certain actions when he takes office. I talk about all that in the agenda, so I hope that you and your viewers will be able to check it out.
Okay, yeah. I'm going to put a direct link to that. I'm going to put a link to all of your most recent articles over on Breitbart News, as well as a direct link to your Twitter account. Joel, thank you so much for keeping us up to date on everything that's going on. You are an incredible writer. You're a very gifted writer, so I urge people to check that out. Thank you so much for coming on. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. I hope to come back on again. Let's revisit all this before the election, or at least before the transition.